June 1944, Camp Scottsbluff, Nebraska. 40 German prisoners of war sat stiff-backed at outdoor tables, their eyes scanning for the trap they knew was coming. They'd been taught Americans were barbaric, that civilization ended at Germany's borders. Then the farmers brought out platters of golden grilled corn, butter melting down the sides, and placed them in front of the prisoners. Hans Fischer stared. In Germany, corn was pig feed, animal food. The laughter started nervous, then bitter. They feed us like livestock, one prisoner said, just like the Führer promised. But then, an American farmer named Earl, who'd lost his son to their war, picked up an ear, a bit into it, and locked eyes with Hans. "This is what free men eat," he said. One by one, the Germans tasted it. Their faces shifted. Surprise, then something deeper. They'd been lied to about everything, and a simple vegetable was about to shatter a lifetime of propaganda. If you want more shocking untold stories that history tried to bury, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far truth can travel. 3 weeks into captivity, Hans had settled into the rhythm of imprisonment. Rise with the dawn, wash at the outdoor pump, line up for work detail. Keep your head low, fulfill your duties, avoid reflection. Not thinking proved the greatest challenge. The sugar beet farms were desperate for labor. Every American man capable of holding a rifle was overseas or building war machines, and crops wouldn't wait for victory. So the prisoners ventured out in groups of 10, guards watching lazily from truck beds as they worked fields that stretched to horizons unimaginable in the cramped German countryside. The work broke backs and spirits. The Nebraska sun showed no mercy, yet water breaks came regularly. Tin cups passed around by guards, whose eyes held something like apology for the relentless heat. Hans worked alongside deer most days, their silence comfortable like men who'd shared foxholes. The American farmers maintained cold distance but demonstrated fairness, showing proper techniques for thinning rows and pulling weeds without damaging young plants, then stepping aside. No shouting, no beatings, just honest labor beneath a sky so intensely blue it hurt to witness. "They're not what they described," Klaus whispered one afternoon, wiping sweat from his boyish face. Too young, too earnest, still believing Germany would triumph and they'd return as heroes. "They're exactly as described," Hans snapped, soft, using prisoners for labor instead of fighting their own battles. Yet even as the words left his mouth, he watched an American farmer grey-haired, built like an old oak working the adjacent row. The man's hands bore the same calluses as Hans's father, his back bent with identical weariness. When he straightened to drink, there was nothing soft in his exhaustion. Deer caught Hans watching and said nothing, his way of letting uncomfortable truths reveal themselves naturally. By the 3rd week, an unexpected shift occurred. Work crews developed efficiency. Americans learned to demonstrate with gestures instead of shouted English. Germans learned which farmers demanded rows thinned to exactly 4 inches, and which accepted 5. No conversation crossed the divide language, and history formed barriers sharp as concertina wire, but rhythm emerged, almost understanding. Then came word about Earl Hutchkins's farm. Private Tommy Chen, the camp translator, announced it during evening roll call. Starting Monday, Group 3 rotates to Hutchkins' property. 2-week assignment, sugar beets and corn harvest. Hans belonged to Group 3. So did Deer, Klaus, and 8 others, including Kurt Zimmer, son of a Gestapo informant who spent evenings reminding anyone within earshot they remained German soldiers, not American pets. "I know the Hutchkins place," one guard muttered to another, voice carrying intentionally. "Earl lost his boy at Normandy. This should prove interesting." Something cold settled in Hans's stomach. A grieving father, German workers. Here, the Geneva Convention's thin veneer would finally crack. Here, the real war, the one living in grief and rage, would show its teeth. Saturday delivered the true shock. Margaret Hutchkins, apparently defying her husband's wishes, had arranged a community cookout. "A tradition," Tommy explained uncomfortably. End of summer gathering for all work crews, American families and German prisoners together. She's hosted this 15 years, won't let war change it. The barracks erupted. Some prisoners laughed nervously. Others fell silent, calculating consequences. Kurt Zimmer stood center, voice slicing through the commotion. It's either a trap or humiliation. They want to watch us beg for scraps. Or it's the Geneva Convention, Dear remarked mildly. They follow rules. Rules? Kurt spat. Is that what you believe this is? They're trying to erase who we are. Make us forget our duty, our brothers still fighting. Hans felt 40 pairs of eyes turn toward him. Though younger than Dear and less intimidating than Kurt, something in his rigid certainty had made him the barracks' conscience quietly, constantly reminding them not to grow comfortable, not to forget. We'll attend, Hans finally said flatly. We'll consume their food if required, but we won't forget. Not our identity, not their actions. It sounded like resistance when spoken, like honor. Yet that night, lying on his thin mattress, Hans felt something shift inside a hairline fracture in the certainty he'd clutched like armor. Because truth was, he no longer knew what to expect, whether Earl Hutchkins would spit in his face, pull a weapon, or simply stand silent in grief while Hans harvested fields his dead son once worked. The only certainty was that Sunday evening he would walk onto that farm, and nothing, not training, propaganda, nor his own fear had prepared him for what awaited. Sunset painted the horizon gold when they marched up the dirt road toward Earl Hutchkins's farm. 10 Germans, flanked by 2 guards who radiated reluctance. Hans maintained rigid posture, expression vacant. Whatever waited humiliation, confrontation, elaborate psychological warfare, he would endure with dignity intact. Then he saw the tables, long wooden platforms arranged outdoors beneath cottonwood trees whose branches filtered golden light. American families gathered in clusters. Farmers Hans recognized from fields, their wives, children darting between tables with the unburdened joy of people who'd never witnessed war on their soil. A band assembled near the barn, someone tuning a fiddle, while aromas filled the air, charcoal smoke, roasting meat, and something sweetly unfamiliar. Margaret Hutchkins emerged from the farmhouse, carrying a basket, grey hair pinned back, face lined with the particular exhaustion that comes from private tears and public smiles. She acknowledged the prisoners with a nod, eyes kind but cautious, and gestured toward the tables. "Please," Tommy translated. The Germans occupied one end, rigid as fence posts. Americans clustered opposite. Conversations dying as both groups studied each other across 10 feet of grass that felt mined with invisible explosives. Hans sensed Kurt Zimmer watching, measuring, waiting for someone to break ranks. Then came the food. Farm wives moved between tables bearing platters, fried chicken glistening with grease, potato salad studded with eggs and pickles, biscuits steaming when broken. Thick slices of tomato, still warm from afternoon sun, betrayed Hans with an audible stomach growl. Years had passed since he'd seen such abundance, not rations, not survival, but plenty. A weathered, middle-aged American farmer, someone Hans had labored alongside that week, placed a platter directly before the German prisoners. Arranged ceremoniously were ears of corn, charred from the grill, butter melting down their sides in golden rivulets, still crackling faintly with heat. Hans stared. Beside him, Dear went perfectly still. Corn animal feed, pig fodder, something grown to fatten livestock before slaughter. Klaus looked questioningly at Hans. Another prisoner, a former Bavarian farmhand, released a short, barking laugh. "This is animal food," he announced in German, loud enough to carry. "They're feeding us like livestock." The laughter spread nervous initially, then bitter. Confirmation of everything they'd been taught. Americans lacked understanding of civilization, of culture. They probably ate with bare hands and slept among animals. Earl Hutchkins stood with such abruptness his chair scraped harshly against packed earth. The yard fell silent. Even children froze mid-play. Hans realized Earl was substantial, not tall, but solid, with shoulders built from decades of labor and hands that looked capable of snapping fence posts. His face was weathered past his ears, grief carved into something almost primordial. He approached the German table, and Hans felt every muscle tense for impact. Margaret touched her husband's arm. "Earl," she whispered. But Earl wasn't looking at her. He lifted an ear of corn from the platter, held it momentarily, something flickering across his face, perhaps memory, perhaps pain too profound for language. Then he bit into it. Butter trickled down his chin. He chewed deliberately, eyes locked on Hans. When he spoke, his voice rasped like gravel. "My son loved this. Last thing I cooked before he shipped out." A pause, heavy as stones. "He died in your country's war." Earl raised the corn, juice running down his wrist. "This is what free men eat." He dropped it back on the table. The sound of impact echoed like a gunshot. Then Earl walked away, back rigid, hands trembling. Hans couldn't breathe. Around him, laughter had vanished. The prisoners sat frozen, caught between defiance and something dangerously resembling shame. Deer slowly reached out, lifted an ear of corn, held it like unexploded ordnance, then bit, expression carefully neutral. His eyes widened. "Mein Gott, I am Himmel," he whispered. "Try it." Hans shook his head, jaw muscle twitching. This was his line in the sand. He wouldn't, couldn't, but Klaus had already reached for one. He bit tentatively, then, with growing confidence, face transformed surprise melting into wonder. Another prisoner followed, then another. Hans watched, horror and confusion battling within. They resembled men discovering something precious they'd been told didn't exist. Across the yard, Earl Hutchkins stood with back turned, his wife's hand on his shoulder, entire frame shaking with the effort of containing grief. And Hans understood with terrible clarity that this wasn't psychological warfare or trickery. This was a father serving his dead son's favorite food to his enemies, because his wife had requested mercy over hatred, and Hans had laughed at it. The corn changed everything. Hans couldn't name it, refused to acknowledge it, but over subsequent weeks he felt the shift like a poorly set bone, painful, inevitable, impossible to ignore. Work continued. Sugar beets yielded to late-season vegetables, and German crews moved through Earl's fields with practiced efficiency. But now small moments fractured the careful distance both sides had maintained. An American farmer humming while working Mozart, incredibly, a piece Hans's mother played on their old piano, Klaus showing a guard his sister's photograph, prompting the American to produce his wallet containing a daughter with identical gap-toothed smile, Deer repairing a broken irrigation pump that had confounded the farm's regular mechanic, earning reluctant respect. Hans noticed everything while feigning blindness. He worked harder than anyone, as if physical exhaustion might silence multiplying questions. These Americans weren't. Soft, they labored sunrise to sunset alongside prisoners, hands equally calloused, backs equally bent. They sang strange, twanging songs about locomotives and heartbreak, but sang as German soldiers once did before Normandy, before everything darkened. Earl rarely addressed prisoners directly, yet his presence remained constant. Hans observed him as soldiers monitor enemy territory seeking weakness, proof that the facade would crumble. But Earl was precisely what he appeared, a man hollowed by grief, performing daily tasks because stopping meant drowning. Sometimes Hans caught him staring at the farthest field, the one with tallest corn face so raw with loss that Hans had to avert his eyes. Life proved simpler when Americans remained monsters, when enemies stayed enemy-shaped. The turning point arrived on a sweltering Wednesday in late August, temperature exceeding 100 degrees, air thick enough to suffocate. Klaus was managing the irrigation line when he stumbled. Hans initially thought he'd tripped and prepared to shout something about attentiveness. Then, Klaus collapsed face first into dirt and remained motionless. Events unfolded simultaneously, too quickly and painfully slow. Hans sprinting, shouting for help, Deer rolling Klaus sideways, the boy's skin ashen, breathing shallow heat stroke evident in every symptom. Then Earl appeared, dropping to his knees, large hand unexpectedly gentle as he lifted Klaus effortlessly. "Get him to shade," Earl commanded, already moving. "Tommy, summon the camp medic. Now." They carried Klaus to the barn, Earl supporting the boy's head. Margaret materialized with dampened cloths, cellar ice wrapped in towels. Earl laid Klaus in the coolest corner, applied ice to neck and wrists, spoke in English that Klaus couldn't comprehend but instinctively responded to the tone, urgency, unmistakable sound of someone refusing to let death claim you. "Stay with me, son," Earl repeated. "Stay with me." Klaus's eyes fluttered, open. Delirious, weeping, German words tumbling too rapidly for Tommy's translation. "Danke," he repeated. "Danke, danke," like a sacred chant. Earl's jaw tightened. He maintained his grip until the camp medic arrived, then stepped back as though stunned by his own actions, saving an enemy, calling him son. Hans observed from the doorway, throat constricted with emotion he refused to identify. This wasn't propaganda or strategy. Earl Hutchkins had lost his child to Hans's homeland, Hans's conflict, perhaps even to ammunition fired by someone wearing Hans's uniform. Yet he'd rushed to save Klaus, carried him like he mattered. That night, as Klaus recovered in the infirmary, Hans finally confronted the question he'd avoided for weeks. "Did they lie to us?" His voice sounded foreign in darkness. "About everything?" Deer's response came quiet but certain. "Eat the corn, Hans. It's just corn. But yes, they lied about everything." Hans closed his eyes, felt his worldview tilt precariously, because if they'd fabricated American barbarism, what else constituted deception? The 1,000-Year Reich, master race theories, a war described as noble and necessary and righteous. If corn could nourish free men rather than livestock, if enemies could appreciate Mozart and demonstrate mercy, then perhaps Hans Fischer had devoted his existence to narratives that were never genuine. That realization terrified him more profoundly than any battlefield he'd ever faced. By late August, something remarkable had occurred, something nobody dared name aloud. Work crews no longer resembled enemy camps separated by armed guards, but something approaching not quite friendship, but understanding, rhythm. Americans taught baseball during lunch breaks, demonstrating with exaggerated pantomime proper batting stance and base running. Germans taught card games requiring no common language, only attention and the universal dialect of competition. Klaus acquired English phrases alarmingly quickly, his youthful mind absorbing vocabulary like parched soil drinks rain. Even Kurt Zimmer suspended nightly lectures about loyalty and duty, though he observed everything narrowly, cataloguing betrayals he'd report if they returned to Germany. Hans increasingly found himself working alongside Earl. Neither spoke much, but communication flowed through movement, Earl gesturing toward missed weeds, Hans indicating sections needing irrigation. Once, Hans retrieved Earl's fallen hat and returned it. Earl nodded. It sufficed. Margaret brought pies, Fridays, apple, cherry, once a custard that nearly reduced Klaus to tears. Prisoners specifically requested corn at mealtimes. The camp cook obliged, grilling it as Earl had demonstrated. Hans now ate without contemplation, appreciating the familiar flavor, only occasionally feeling phantom shame for his initial mockery. One September evening, Earl permitted Hans to tend the farthest field, the one yielding sweetest corn, the one Hans had observed him watching with raw emotion. Earl offered no explanation, simply handed Hans tools and departed. But Hans recognized this was Joseph's field, the son's territory, and Earl was entrusting an enemy soldier with its care. Hans worked that ground reverently, because it was sacred. For one golden moment, suspended in late summer heat amid exhausted bodies and shared meals, war seemed distant. Not concluded all knew better but muted, like approaching thunder that might, miraculously, bypass them entirely. Peace no longer felt impossible. It resembled corn growing straight and tall, laughter bridging linguistic barriers. Earl's hand briefly resting on Hans's shoulder after Hans correctly repaired equipment contact so fleeting Hans nearly missed it, yet it burned like brands upon skin. Then, September arrived bearing news that shattered everything. The telegram came Tuesday. Hans was tending the nearest field when Tommy appeared, translator's expression deliberately neutral, in a manner signalling terrible tidings. Hans Fischer, report to camp office. The return journey felt like drowning. Hans's thoughts raced through possibilities. Reassignment, punishment, perhaps correspondence from his long silent mother. He wasn't prepared for the Red Cross official, the flimsy paper, words that would fracture his world anew. His brother Friedrich, killed during Allied bombing of Hamburg, age 16. Hans heard and comprehended the words, but his body rejected them. He stood motionless while the official expressed condolences in carefully diplomatic German. Tommy translated, though Hans now understood sufficient English protocol demanded formality. When Hans finally returned to barracks, rage flooded where shock had been. Friedrich, baby brother, who'd idolized Hans, who'd written letters filled with Hitler, youth rhetoric, and childlike faith that Germany would triumph, that Hans would return heroic dead, crushed beneath American bombs, dropped by American aircraft, piloted by men resembling Earl, resembling farmers Hans worked alongside, resembling guards who'd taught baseball. That evening, Hans couldn't face any of them, couldn't tolerate another meal, another conversation, another moment pretending they were anything but enemies. He found Earl near the equipment shed. Words erupted like gunfire. They killed my brother. His English fractured fury sharpening every syllable. Your people, your bombs. You speak of peace, of corn. Your people murder children. Earl's complexion bleached white, then reddened, fists clenched. And your people murdered my son. They stood separated by 10 feet, two fathers drowning in grief. The chasm that had been narrowing for weeks suddenly gaped, impassable again. All shared meals, all careful bridge building, all moments of near understanding vanished, incinerated by bombs and bullets, and the unbearable weight of loving those the war had claimed. Hans turned away before committing something unforgivable, before forgetting that even rage observed boundaries. Hans refused to leave his bunk for 3 days. He lay immobile while fellow prisoners departed for work, while roll call proceeded without him, while the camp commander threatened discipline, while Deer advocated patience, while Kurt Zimmer muttered about weakness infecting them all. Hans didn't care. His universe contracted to the photograph clutched in his hand. Friedrich at 14, smiling in Hitler Youth uniform, believing every indoctrination. Deer brought food. Hans rejected it, bread, watery soup, even water until his lips cracked, and Deer physically forced a canteen to his mouth. On the 3rd evening, Deer returned with a tray emitting unfamiliar aromas. Hans faced the wall. Why torture me? His voice emerged raw, barely human. Deer placed the tray with deliberate care. Upon it, still steaming, sat a single ear of grilled corn. Because remembering your humanity isn't torture, Deer said quietly. Forgetting is. Hans wanted to hurl it, wanted to scream that humanity was fabrication. That kindness was deception, that the only truth lay in his brother's death and Earl's son's death, and all deaths that would continue until someone finally claimed victory or everyone perished. But exhaustion overwhelmed him, bone-deep weariness from carrying hatred as armor. He didn't consume the corn, but didn't discard it either. That same night, Earl couldn't sleep. He'd attempted everything, lying motionless, reading scripture, helping Margaret with housework until she gently directed him toward bed. Nothing succeeded. His thoughts continually returned to Hans's expression to raw grief, mirroring Earl's own reflection to the terrible symmetry that they were both fathers who'd lost sons, and war remained indifferent to this parallel. At midnight, Earl surrendered, donned boots, and walked to the camp perimeter. He lacked purpose or plan, only knew remaining abed was impossible. The compound stood, silent except for solitary light burning in one barracks, Hans's quarters. Earl waited, his son's final letter folded in his pocket as it had been for months. He'd read it so frequently the creases were disintegrating. Tell Mom I love her. Tell her I'm careful. Tell her this ends soon and I'll return and we'll have corn and everything returns to normal. But nothing would, never could, because Joseph was gone and Earl's heart shattered, and no quantity of corn or prayer or fury would alter reality. Impulsively, or perhaps from something deeper than impulse, something dangerously resembling grace. Earl approached his truck, drove home, returned 20 minutes later with cloth-wrapped bundle. He left it with the gate guard alongside a note penciled on a feed receipt, handwriting unsteady. Morning brought it to Hans. The guard delivered it, expression indicating he'd read the message without comprehending any of it, but followed instructions regardless. Hans unwrapped the fabric slowly. Inside waited a jar of preserves, label inscribed in careful script, Margaret's strawberry, Joseph's favourite. The note read simply, directly. Each word seemed chiselled from granite. My son's name was Joseph. He was 19. I hate that he's gone. I hate this war, but I don't hate you. That's all I have left to give. Hans read it repeatedly. His hands trembled. Tears arrived unbidden, not quiet weeping, but wrenching sobs erupting from depths he'd forgotten existed. He wept for Friedrich, for Joseph, for every boy who'd believed lies and perished for them. For himself, for something within him that died at Normandy, yet somehow struggled to revive in a Nebraska prison camp. Dear discovered him hunched over the note, shoulders heaving, preserves cradled like precious crystal. Dear remained silent, simply sitting beside him, waiting. When Hans finally spoke, his voice barely whispered, "He lost his son to us, and he doesn't hate me." "No," Dear affirmed quietly. "He doesn't." "How?" The question emerged desperate, bewildered. "How does anyone manage that?" Dear paused thoughtfully. "I believe that's what they've attempted to show us throughout. Choosing against hatred, that's the challenge. That's genuine strength." Hans examined the jar, the note, evidence that Earl Hutchkins had driven to camp during night's darkest hours to offer his enemy a gift, costing everything and nothing. And Hans finally understood this wasn't weakness. This was courage, stripped of propaganda and lies.